This is Don Quixote Doflamingo, one of the most accomplished antagonists in all of One Piece, who built an underground empire that made even the world government bend their knee to him. He was untouchable, which is why it was very surprising when he did indeed get touched. This is the rise and fall of one of the greatest empires in this world, helmed by a man who is an icon of One Piece, to the point where if you've never seen or read the series before, you've still probably seen him at some point. That's just how much Doflamingo has been elevated to a cultural icon. So what I want to know is, how did Oda manage to achieve this, and how does Doflamingo compare to other brilliantly written One Piece villains? Because we're on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the heavenly demon himself, Doflamingo. Also, I'd like to start with Doflamingo's strongest feature as an antagonist in my opinion, which is his compelling persona. What makes Doflamingo immediately stand out is that he does not that, and that his appearances were used so sparingly for the vast majority of the series. Doflamingo was first introduced in chapter 233, attending a meeting to, rather ironically, discuss Crocodile's replacement, which is funny because Doflamingo would go on to essentially become the post-time skip Crocodile and thus his replacement. So thinking about it, he was the right person to be at that meeting. But Doflamingo strolled confidently into the story, swinging a thick with so many seas bounty of 340 million berries. And after this grand introduction, he took a year and a half off, reappearing in chapter 303, where after Skypiea, we discover that Doflamingo was the man backing Bellamy, and that he had a rather sinister plan for some sort of vaguely defined new age. Lots of words there, lots of work there, so much so that Doflamingo then took a 5-year hiatus after this. His next appearance was frustratingly almost exactly 200 chapters later, in 504, when it was revealed that he was the owner of the human auction house on Sabari, and that maybe, just maybe, we should be paying attention to all of these smiley faces that we keep seeing pop up all over the One Piece world, because they all seem to lead back to Doflamingo. All of a sudden, 6 years into this journey, we were starting to seriously build some momentum behind this curiosity snowball. I also love this scene in the anime because Doflamingo is just chilling on a prototype Dressrosa, which is this humble little beach, and they've got him in a cheap motel chair. But when the actual Dressrosa comes around, Doflamingo's living situation has been upgraded to a mansion and a mega couch. But for now, in 2009, Doflamingo participated in the Paramount War, and he had some highlights but remained a tantalizingly unexplored combatant. And it wouldn't be until 3 years after that, in chapter 682 titled Puppet Master, where it becomes clear that finally, literally a decade after he was first introduced, that it was time to explore Doflamingo. In terms of build-up, Doflamingo got more seed time than the vast majority of manga series have to publish their entire story. And even compared to other great One Piece villains, let's say Crocodile. Crocodile had about 30 chapters of sweet mystery before we got to tackle him, so that's a little over half a year of publishing time back then, whereas Doflamingo had 20 times that amount of time to seed his presence within the One Piece world, which was done masterfully by Oda. Even though across 10 years he rarely appeared, you could still feel his presence in the world, and you knew that he was a big deal. The mystery aspect of Doflamingo is unmatched by any One Piece antagonist. You could maybe make an argument for the 5 Elder Stars or Imu, but nobody has been as immediately gripping as Doflamingo. And after all that time, Doflamingo had the audacity to live up to the hype. From the moment the Dressrosa arc began until this very day, Doflamingo has never ranked outside the top 20 of an officially conducted character popularity poll. To put that into some perspective, there's over 1,000 characters in One Piece who are eligible for such polls. So for Doflamingo to remain so consistently within that top 2%, it means that even though he does very bad things, he's doing those bad things very rightly. And one of those right things is being a villain with an understandable motivation. Don't confuse understandable with empathetic. I understand why Doflamingo is the way he is, because he was raised as a world noble. He was indoctrinated to the point where it became ingrained into his life's philosophy. I understand that, but I don't empathize with it, and I don't need to. All I need to know is that every action he takes is performed with the core belief that he is a superior being above those that he's forced to congregate with. Which is why I can also forgive a lot of Doflamingo's poor decision making during the Dressrosa arc, because that's just who he is. Someone with such an ingrained superiority complex is not going to plan for an event where his schemes are thwarted, because the idea of that happening never even enters his mind, which makes him fascinating because he's so smart and so dumb at the same time. An example that I like to point out is that time when Doflamingo tried to kill Fujitora. He attacks the Marine Admiral and says, "Hee hee, I could have sworn I just heard you say, 'Get rid of me right now while you have the chance, Doflamingo.'" And the arrogance on his face to think that he could take on a Marine Admiral, and that even if he could, he'd be able to get away with it. But here's the thing, right? Doflamingo, he thinks he's being smart. He thinks he's reading Fujitori's subtle intent and then decides to get in with the first strike. And whilst those are the general, obviously portrayed vibes of Fujitora, what this Marine Admiral is doing is playing a game of political chess, whilst Doflamingo is at the child's table playing fictional pirate checkers. Doflamingo is a man of above average intelligence who thinks he's a genius, and that's why his plan works for me. In case you don't remember, Doflamingo's ultimate goal was something world domination. He was going to use Trafalgar Law's Devil Fruit in combination with the mysterious national treasure, which would equal him being the best flamingo boy and crowned ruler of the world somehow. It really is that vague because at the time of this recording, we still don't have confirmation on what that national treasure is, but I despise world domination, both in concept and when it's used as a motivation. I just think it's such a boring way to write a villain. However, this is a case where it works, because it was established from birth that this world is Doflamingo's plaything. That's his right as a world noble, and because he was taken away from their society at such a young age, Doflamingo doesn't really have any concept of equality. He's never lived with his peers, his fellow esteemed world nobles. All horrible people, but horrible people who all respect one another. From Doflamingo's perspective, he's never had that equal. He's always been the special one in every scenario, and so of course he believes that the only natural goal for him is to rule the world, because he's the only one with the right to do it. The only extended contact he had with a fellow world noble was his younger brother Rocinante. However, Doflamingo was very protective of him and took on a senior leadership role. So what is usually a bit of a narratively bankrupt goal is actually the only natural conclusion that Doflamingo could have come to. It sounds stupid, so stupid, but it makes so much sense with him. And that's why it becomes so satisfying to watch Doflamingo bury himself in a grave dug by his own decisions. But there is also a very important, just a little bit of shred of sympathy to be had with Doflamingo. We even get a flashback dedicated to him specifically, and it's quite tragic, because Doflamingo's family were hunted, tortured, his mother died of illness, and all of it was objectively his father's fault. Although I can't quite get to the point where I can transform that sympathy into empathy. I'm not an emotional alchemist. Because the thing is, if he'd stayed on Marijwar and everything was fine, he'd become a full world noble, and then he'd be causing untold horror to others. But a life of crime is also a very natural path for Doflamingo. From his perspective, the moment he was cast out of Marijwar, he was amongst the lowest of the low. All humans are scum, there are no clean humans. So joining the underworld to him is no different from living a peaceful life in a crime-free town. Basically, everything about Doflamingo, it just clicks. I've never had the feeling that he's done something out of character, which I have had with a few One Piece antagonists, which we'll eventually get to. But all of his decisions, whether they're good or bad decisions, makes complete sense for who and what he is. And so Doflamingo feels a lot less like a drawing in a fictional pirate comic and more like a living, breathing presence. And that's only enhanced by his brilliant aesthetic design. Doflamingo's design is very loud and eye-grabbing, to say the least. It commands your attention through the power of bold fashion choices, and I love the fact that he wears sunglasses. So long as there's a well-written character behind them, sunglasses always contribute to this beautiful air of mystery, because it gives you the feeling that something is always being hidden from you. There's always this physical barrier between you and the character, and so you can't quite connect with them. Doflamingo isn't a tangible character that you can grab onto and understand. All you see is the facade that he chooses to portray. And I do think it says a lot that the iconic moment of Doflamingo's defeat is capped off by seeing those sunglasses broken. How many other One Piece villains have this kind of object? Crocodile's hook is pretty iconic, so is Katakuri's scarf, but neither of them hold anywhere near close to the same symbolic weight as these sunglasses. It's such powerful branding. You can give anyone or anything a pair of these sunglasses and bam, they're Doflamingo. You can feel his persona through these glasses alone. Whether you be me, my wife, or my dog, we are all Flamingo. And you can even get yourself a Doflamingo shirt at storegl.com. But there is a point in the series where we do see one of Doflamingo's eyes, and there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. I honestly question whether or not Oda should have shown that eye at all, but I'm really glad he never chose to show both of them, because Doflamingo would probably end up looking something like this and completely kill the mystery factor. Also, a big part of Doflamingo's persona is smiling. He's almost always shown smiling, which really adds to these sinister vibes, because it just makes you ask yourself, what kind of sick crap is he thinking at all times to make himself smile like that? I don't know. I don't want to know. Maybe I want to know, but it's probably not good. And really, in the end, you can never know for sure because he has such a surprising emotional range. What I love most about Doflamingo is that range of personality, because many of the world nobles are very one-note. They're bad for the sake of being bad. Whereas Doflamingo is, admittedly, a horrendous person, but he does have these selective moments of intrigue and humanity. And actually, Doflamingo quite perfectly explains his own feelings in chapter 747. I lost my mother when I was 8 and killed my father when I was 10. The officers in my service are family who have been been with me through thick and thin. They're all I have, and I do not forgive those who laugh at my family. Is that understood? You know, if you read that quote and that quote alone, you might mistake Doflamingo for a protagonist, because that level of family bond, minus the parent killing, is really what you'd expect of, say, Luffy and the Straw Hats, although that's where Doflamingo's feelings cease. If you're outside of the officer class, then you're just, more human trash to him. But the fact that a villain of Doflamingo's scale is even allowed to have emotions on a similar level to how Luffy feels about his crew is endlessly fascinating and creates a lot of compelling dynamics. For example, on Punk Hazard, Doflamingo is quite saddened when he has to ask Monet to die for him. It's an intriguing clash of that world noble ideology versus the human connections he's built. Doflamingo formed a real, genuine bond with Monet, but because of his world noble heritage, he still has to see her as disposable. And it leads to this amazing scene where Doflamingo admits he made a mistake. He says, "I've misread the situation. I've done a terrible thing to you all." And then he has to ask Monet to give her life to fix it. And she's more than willing to do it. In fact, she predicted that Doflamingo would ask this. That kind of antagonist crew bond is so rare. And sadly, even going forward in One Piece, we almost never see it. But in a series with such a heavy focus on friendship and found family, I love seeing a villain who is carried by his crew, nay his family, in the same way that Luffy is carried by the Straw Hats. Overall, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more compelling antagonist than Doflamingo. Every time he's on page or on screen, he completely steals the show. And really, when I think of the Dressrosa arc, I think of Doflamingo. So much happened during that arc, but it's all characterized under him. So he receives full marks for compelling persona and understandable motivation, but what we need to look at next is threat level. This one's very simple. If the main villain doesn't pose some kind of threat, then what is even the point of having one? And Doflamingo is timed to perfection in One Piece because he's Luffy's first big challenge in the post-time skip era, much like how Crocodile was Luffy's first big challenge in the pre-time skip era. And when it came down to it, anything Luffy could throw, Doflamingo could take. Doflamingo strolled into this conflict with all three types of Haki, including the very special Some Conqueror's Haki, as well as an awakened Devil Fruit. And I want to make this clear, not even Gear 4th Luffy could beat him. Luffy was unable to put down Doflamingo before his time in the form was up, and it was the citizens of Dressrosa that collectively bought Luffy the time to finish him. But honestly, power is the least threatening aspect of Doflamingo. I've brought him up a lot in this video, but these two villains are just so narratively linked, and my point is that Crocodile's plan was to take over Alabasta, which was thwarted, but Doflamingo feels threatening because he shows you what would have happened if that plan succeeded. Not only was Doflamingo able to enslave an entire country, but he was able to convince them to be happy about it. Doflamingo's true threat is terrifying because, like all good horror, it largely remains unseen and left to the imagination. His whole empire is relegated to the underworld, which orchestrates his activities on Dressrosa, making it appear to be a lovely, happy country, but with a series of twisted secrets that gradually get revealed one by one, each more horrific than the last. I don't know why I said horrific. Also, one thing that Doflamingo did that really makes him stand apart from other villains was exert control over the world government. And I struggle to think of anyone else who has ever been able to invoke this kind of power, but Doflamingo, the absolute mad lad, was able to blackmail the world government. What he ordered them to do, they did. And we're talking about the same world government led by the 5 Elder Stars and Emu. For a time, they were obeying Doflamingo's orders. Again, no wonder he thought that he was entitled to rule the world. He had the world's undisputed greatest power working for him. Admittedly, it was very restricted powers. Doflamingo couldn't really ask for anything too unreasonable, but this is the sort of power that not even Emperors of the Sea have been able to access. Now, what I will say is that Doflamingo, after reading himself up and altering himself into these positions, he kind of screws himself over. On the one side, he's goaded the greatest military might on the planet, and on the other, he's doing business with Emperor of the Sea Kaido. And by business, I mean that Doflamingo is terrified of Kaido and has essentially become his middleman. Doflamingo was punching well above his weight, and there is some acknowledgement of that to his credit, but his superiority complex, mate, it's so out of this world that even though Doflamingo knows he's outclassed, he believes, because of his world nobliness, that he's gonna be able to eventually outplay each and every one of them. So Doflamingo's threat is definitely high, but it's still a clear step below the world government, and probably any Emperor of the Sea, despite his very unique situation. Now, quite possibly the most important criteria for a villain. Does Doflamingo have a satisfying payoff? I personally think so, because before Wano, Dressrosa used to take a lot of criticism because the arc took over 2 years to publish, but considering that Doflamingo had a decade of build-up behind him, I think that commanding the story for 2 years is very appropriate, because that's what he did. Luffy was the protagonist, but during Dressrosa, it was the Doflamingo show. And I don't know if any other villain has ever been able to sort of take that title off Luffy, at least in my opinion. Again, when I think of Dressrosa, I think of Doflamingo. And there's also a huge element of satisfaction in the final attack by having Luffy smack Doflamingo out of the sky, very symbolically dispelling his god complex and forcing the taste of bitter, bitter earth into his probably open mouth. He's also being beaten by a member of the D-Clan, the now established enemy of the gods, which we see juxtaposed with Law watching the final attack. And really, it all just comes together flawlessly for me. The only negative I'd say about Doflamingo's defeat is that, again in my opinion, the anime butchered it by turning Luffy's final punch into a minute-long filler struggle instead of the instant and unstoppable punishment from the heavens that Doflamingo received in the manga. But regardless, I'm not going to judge a manga character based on his anime adaptation. So Doflamingo gets a pretty amazing score for payoff as well, especially considering that this was the climax of a 12-year arc. And the best part is that after that, he begins a new arc. And so there's one more thing I want from a villain, and this is very One Piece specific criteria I have, because it's something that Eiichiro Oda is so phenomenal at, which is giving villains a fully rounded character arc, extending beyond their tenure as arc antagonists. What I love seeing is the villain learning and changing. That doesn't necessarily mean change for the better, but I want their downfall to inform their future actions and see a visible shift. And with Doflamingo, I think we definitely do see that. After Dressrosa, he gets carted away to Impel Down, and in chapter 906, he already displays quite a radical shift. Doflamingo assumes that an assassin has come to kill him in order to prevent him from sharing the information that he used to blackmail the world government. And in response to this brain thought, he says out loud, "Just let the secret out. Power has such a short shelf life. It goes bad very quickly." This is Doflamingo coming to terms with the fact that he's not the eternal special boy he thought he was. He no longer has this maniacal belief that everyone and everything belongs to him just because of who he is. After being removed from the power struggles of the world, Doflamingo has developed a new perspective, and I think he realizes just how ridiculous a lot of his efforts were. And 50 or so chapters later, we see him again in Impel Down reading a newspaper and cackling endlessly to himself about what's going on in the world. The world never gets old, does it? Things are just getting good now. As a result of his conflict with Luffy, Doflamingo has done the impossible and learned a bit of humility. After taking a step back, he realizes that there are no players in this game, only pieces. And now that he's out, he's just enjoying the game as a spectator, watching people fight and struggle for the power equivalent of milk. It's nice while you've got it, but it's gonna spoil quickly, unless you have long life milk, but even that doesn't last forever. If it did, they would call it forever milk. And that's not to say that Doflamingo is out of this series for good. If he ever did escape Impel Down, then I do think he'd compete again, but with a refreshed viewpoint. So this sounds weird to say about a flamingo cackling in striped pajamas, but he's matured, and I would love to see where that leads him if given the opportunity. As for his placement, to me, Doflamingo is another undeniable S-tier villain who has everything going for him. He's compelling, understandable, highly threatening, so satisfying to watch, and continues to have a character arc to this very day. So you let me know in the comments, where would you rank Doflamingo, and which One Piece villain would you like to see next? And thanks so much again to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video, and you can join the fun for free through my link in the description.